Imagine a country closed off from the world for more than 200 years. A place where samurai walked the streets with swords at their sides, where peasants bowed to lords, and where foreign ships were seen as a threat rather than an opportunity. This was Japan in the middle of the 19th century, a nation bound by tradition and determined to keep the outside world at bay. But everything was about to change. The arrival of black ships on Japan's shores did not just bring foreign demands. It set in motion one of the most remarkable transformations in history. In the span of a single generation, Japan would rise from an isolated feudal state to a modern world power. Samurai would be forced to put aside their swords, farmers would face new taxes, and cities would be filled with railways, factories, and electricity. A teenage emperor, once expected to play a ceremonial role, would become the symbol of unity and progress. Wars would be fought, victories won, and a once insular nation would step boldly onto the global stage. How did this happen so quickly? What drove Japan to abandon centuries of tradition in order to survive? And what lessons can we learn from a nation that reshaped itself in less than half a century? The story of the Meiji Restoration is not just about battles or treaties. It is about vision, sacrifice, and the struggle to find balance between old identity and new ambition. It is a story that still echoes in Japan today and continues to inspire people around the world. Welcome to our channel Words of Time, and in this video we are going to explore the incredible journey of Japan's transformation during the Meiji era from isolation to empire. Japan in the 17th century had entered into a long period of enforced isolation under the Tokugawa shogunate. The ruling family, based in Edo, which would later be called Tokyo, had established a system that brought stability after long centuries of civil war. The shogun was the true power in the land, while the emperor remained a symbolic figure in Kyoto, surrounded by ancient rituals but stripped of practical influence. The shogun's authority rested on a finely balanced order that kept the daimyo, the regional lords, under close control, and it maintained the samurai as a warrior class bound by loyalty, strict codes of conduct, and a rigid hierarchy. For more than 200 years, this structure remained largely untouched, and Japan closed itself off from most contact with the outside world. Foreign trade was limited to a few carefully supervised exchanges, mainly with Dutch merchants confined to a small island at Nagasaki and with some Chinese traders. Christian missionaries, who had been active in earlier decades, were expelled, and converts were harshly suppressed. The shogunate believed that isolation was necessary to protect stability and to prevent the disruptive influence of foreign powers. At first glance, this decision appeared successful. The Tokugawa period brought peace to a country that had known constant war during the late medieval era. Agriculture improved, towns grew, and culture flourished in forms such as kabuki theater, ukiyo-e woodblock prints, and haiku poetry. Yet beneath this surface calm, strains began to emerge. The rigid social hierarchy, while orderly in theory, became increasingly inflexible in practice. At the top of the social order stood the samurai, followed by peasants, artisans, and merchants. Merchants occupied the lowest official rank, yet over time they grew wealthy through trade and urban activity, while many samurai, who were forbidden to engage in commerce, fell into debt and poverty. The contradiction between official status and real economic power created tension that could not easily be ignored. The daimyo, too, were placed in a deliberately weakened position by the shogunate. They were required to divide their time between their own domains and the capital at Edo, where they had to maintain lavish residences that drained their treasuries. Their families were often kept in Edo as a form of hostages, ensuring loyalty. This system, known as alternate attendance, secured the shogun's authority but left many lords resentful and financially strained. In rural areas, peasants bore the heavy burden of taxes, and poor harvests often led to uprisings. These revolts, though usually small and quickly suppressed, showed that beneath the surface of Tokugawa order there was deep dissatisfaction. Cultural and intellectual life also reflected cracks in the old system. The Confucian ideals promoted by the shogunate stressed loyalty, hierarchy, and obedience, but new schools of thought began to question these principles. Some scholars called for a return to Shinto traditions that emphasized the emperor's divine role, while others studied Western science and technology, known as rangaku, through the limited channels of Dutch trade. These strands of thought did not yet threaten the shogunate directly, but they prepared the ground for future challenges. While Japan was turning inward, the outside world was changing rapidly. The European powers had embarked on global exploration and colonization centuries earlier, and by the 19th century the Industrial Revolution had transformed their economies and militaries. Steamships, modern weapons, and advanced science gave them tools that no Asian state could easily resist. China, once seen by Japan as the great model of civilization, was forced to open its ports under pressure from Britain after the Opium War. This humiliating defeat of a neighbor sent a warning signal to Japanese observers who realized that the isolation policy might no longer protect them from foreign encroachment. The first signs of direct threat came in the form of foreign ships appearing in Japanese waters. Russian expeditions probed from the north, while British and American vessels occasionally sought supplies or trading rights. The shogunate tried to maintain its policy of refusal, insisting that foreigners had no right to demand entry. But the arrival of modern warships, armed with cannons that easily outmatched Japan's defenses, revealed the weakness of this stance. In 1853, when Commodore Matthew Perry sailed into Edo Bay with a squadron of American steamships, the reality of Japan's vulnerability became undeniable. The sight of black-hulled ships belching smoke, far larger and more powerful than anything Japan possessed, shocked the nation. The shogunate faced a dilemma that would have been unthinkable a century earlier. On one side was the deeply entrenched policy of isolation, tied to the belief that foreign influence would destroy Japan's traditions and social order. On the other was the clear demonstration that Western powers had the means to impose their will by force if necessary. The demands Perry presented were modest at first, requests for safe harbor, supplies, and the opening of limited trade, but they symbolized the beginning of a new age. The Japanese leadership had to decide whether to resist at all costs, risking war with nations whose technology was vastly superior, or to yield and accept changes that would undermine the very foundations of Tokugawa rule. This crisis exposed the fragility of the political structure. The shogunate, once unchallenged, now faced criticism from many sides. Some samurai argued that Japan must resist foreign intrusion, drawing inspiration from loyalty to the emperor and from traditional values. Others argued that the country must learn from the West, adopt its technology, and reform its institutions to survive. The daimyo, long resentful of Tokugawa dominance, saw an opportunity to assert their own visions for Japan's future. Intellectuals who had studied Western science or who had revived interest in Shinto teachings provided ideological support for reform or resistance. The unity that had sustained the shogunate during the long centuries of peace was breaking apart. The choice was not only political, but also social and cultural. Accepting foreign trade and influence meant opening Japan to ideas and technologies that would transform daily life. Weapons, ships, and machines could modernize the military and economy, but they also threatened to erode the rigid class system. Merchants stood to gain further wealth and influence, while samurai risked losing their privileged position if military power shifted to modern forces rather than swords and honor. Peasants might see some relief if agricultural improvements spread, but they could also be swept into new burdens demanded by modernization. The question of how Japan would preserve its identity while engaging with the wider world was no less pressing than the immediate issue of foreign pressure. As the shogunate wavered, the sense of an impending transformation spread. The empire that had remained isolated for more than 2 centuries stood on the brink of change it could neither fully resist nor easily control. The world beyond Japan had grown far more dangerous and interconnected, and the fortress of isolation that once seemed impregnable was crumbling under the weight of new realities. In the years ahead, the struggle to resolve these tensions would lead to dramatic upheavals, but even before those events unfolded, the cracks were plain to see. Japan, still a feudal realm of samurai and shogun, faced the stark choice of clinging to the past or entering a new and uncertain age under the shadow of Western power. The collapse of the Tokugawa shogunate did not occur in a single moment, but was the result of years of rising tension, failed reforms, and the increasing inability of the ruling order to manage both domestic unrest and foreign pressure. Once Commodore Perry forced the opening of Japanese ports in the 1850s, the Tokugawa leaders attempted to find a middle path that would preserve their power while conceding enough to Western powers to avoid open conflict. They signed unequal treaties that granted foreigners special privileges and restricted Japan's ability to control its own trade. These agreements were deeply unpopular, especially among the samurai and intellectuals who believed that Japan was being humiliated and stripped of sovereignty. The cry of Sano Joy, meaning revere the emperor and expel the barbarians, gained force across the domains, capturing both nationalist sentiment and anger at the shogunate's weakness. This growing discontent became a weapon for domains that had long chafed under Tokugawa control. Satsuma in the south and Choshu in the west were among the strongest and most determined to challenge the old regime. Their leaders realized that direct resistance to Western powers was impossible with Japan's outdated weapons, but they also saw that the shogunate's authority was collapsing under the weight of its own indecision. By appealing to the figure of the emperor, who remained distant and symbolic in Kyoto, they could unite opposition under a banner that carried immense legitimacy. The emperor, though largely powerless in practical terms, was considered a divine descendant, and thus the only figure whose authority could rival or surpass that of the shogun. In this atmosphere, a young boy named Mutsuhito was living within the imperial court. Born in 1852, he had been raised in the traditional seclusion of Kyoto's palace, far from the battles and politics shaping the country. His education was steeped in classical Chinese literature, Shinto ritual, and Confucian values, with little exposure to the outside world. No one at the time could have foreseen that this boy would become the central figure in one of the most dramatic transformations in Japanese history. Yet history had prepared the stage for him. When his father, Emperor Meiji, died suddenly in 1867, Mutsuhito ascended the throne at the age of only 15. He became Emperor Meiji, a title that meant enlightened rule, though the true meaning of that phrase would unfold only with time. At first, few expected the young emperor to play an active role in politics. The court had long been a ceremonial institution, and power struggles revolved around shoguns and daimyo, not the cloistered figure in Kyoto. However, circumstances had changed so radically that the very presence of a new emperor became a rallying point. Reformist forces in Satsuma and Choshu seized upon his ascension as an opportunity to cloak their own ambitions in the sacred legitimacy of imperial restoration. In early 1868, they orchestrated a coup in Kyoto, declaring that the emperor had restored direct rule, though in reality the decision was made by ambitious samurai leaders who intended to govern in his name. The Tokugawa were stripped of their authority, and what followed was a brief but decisive civil war. The Boshin War, fought between 1868 and 1869, pitted the loyalists of the new imperial government against the remaining forces of the Tokugawa. Although the Tokugawa still commanded a large army, their opponents had modernized weapons, Western-trained troops, and the advantage of nationalistic fervor. Battle by battle, the imperial side gained ground, and the symbolism of fighting for the emperor proved decisive in rallying support. By the spring of 1869, Tokugawa resistance had collapsed, and the shogunate system, which had ruled Japan for more than 2.5 centuries, was no more. The emperor, still a teenager, now stood as the symbolic head of a new government. The power of this symbolism cannot be overstated. For centuries the emperor had been more of a ritual figure than a ruler, performing ceremonies while others wielded real authority. Yet at this critical juncture, the very idea of imperial rule provided the unity Japan needed. By presenting reforms and modernization as acts carried out in the emperor's name, leaders of the new government could legitimize changes that might otherwise have seemed too radical. The emperor became a living embodiment of national pride, an anchor in a moment of upheaval. The young Meiji did not dictate policy, but his presence gave those around him the ability to act boldly. Still, challenges loomed on every side. The government that claimed to rule in the emperor's name faced suspicion, opposition, and enormous practical tasks. Modernization was not a simple choice, but a process that required resources, planning, and painful restructuring of society. The samurai class, once the backbone of the nation's identity, found its role rapidly diminishing as the government introduced modern conscript armies. Merchants, who had been at the bottom of the social hierarchy, were now in a position to thrive in a market-driven economy, further upsetting old hierarchies. The daimyo, stripped of their domains and ordered to return their lands to the emperor in the name of national unity, saw their centuries-old authority evaporate. Peasants, who had borne the heaviest burdens in Tokugawa times, were now subject to new taxes and obligations as the government sought revenue for modernization projects. Against this backdrop, many wondered whether the young emperor could truly hold the country together. He was still learning to navigate public appearances, still adapting to the sudden shift from the quiet rituals of Kyoto to the political theater of the new capital at Tokyo. His court was filled with advisors, most of whom were older, battle-tested leaders from the domains that had engineered the restoration. The question was whether the emperor was a mere puppet, or whether he would grow into a figure capable of embodying the vision of a modern Japan. For skeptics, the sight of a teenager thrust into such a role seemed like a recipe for instability. And yet, step by step, the emperor began to shape his image in ways that reinforced the legitimacy of the new government. Public appearances, rare for emperors in previous centuries, became more frequent. The young sovereign was presented as both a modern ruler and a guardian of tradition, a bridge between the old and the new. He was portrayed in portraits dressed in Western military uniforms, while at ceremonies he remained surrounded by Shinto rites that emphasized his sacred lineage. This duality was carefully crafted, but it resonated with a population struggling to reconcile reverence for the past with the demands of the future. The challenges in the early years of the Meiji era were immense. The new government had to negotiate the continued presence of unequal treaties with Western powers, while simultaneously building the institutions that could one day allow Japan to renegotiate those terms. It had to modernize its military, its economy, and its educational system in order to stand as an equal among nations that had centuries of industrial development behind them. It also had to maintain domestic unity in the face of samurai uprisings, peasant unrest, and skepticism from those who doubted that such rapid change was possible without chaos. Through all of this, the emperor's image as a unifying figure remained vital. His youth, once seen as a weakness, became in some ways an asset, for he could embody the idea of renewal and rebirth in a nation entering uncharted territory. In the minds of many Japanese, the restoration was not merely a political shift, but a spiritual renewal. The emperor, though still largely controlled by his advisors, stood as a living connection to the nation's divine past, while also symbolizing the hope of a modern, independent future. This delicate balance between continuity and transformation gave the Meiji era its distinctive power. For the young emperor himself, it meant carrying expectations that were greater than any single person could fulfill, yet also stepping into a role that would define his reign as one of the most transformative in history. The overthrow of the Tokugawa shogunate and the rise of Emperor Meiji opened the gates to an era of sweeping transformation, and the years that followed were marked by the dismantling of ancient systems and the construction of entirely new foundations for the state. The vision of the leaders who ruled in the emperor's name was clear. Japan could not survive as an independent nation if it clung to the structures of feudalism, while the world beyond its shores was defined by industrial might and modern institutions. The restoration of imperial rule had been framed in terms of honoring tradition, but the irony was that survival required breaking away from much of the old order. What began as a political revolution soon became a social, economic, and cultural one that touched every class and every village across the islands. The most symbolic and contentious of the early reforms was the abolition of the samurai class. For centuries, these warriors had embodied the very spirit of Japan, bound by codes of loyalty and duty, serving as the ruling elite under the shogunate. Their swords were not only weapons, but symbols of their identity and honor. Yet in a modern state modeled after Western powers, the notion of a hereditary warrior class made little sense. A modern army required trained soldiers drawn from the population as a whole, equipped with firearms, drilled in contemporary tactics, and organized under a centralized command. The leaders of the new government knew that as long as the samurai retained their privileges, Japan could not move forward. The process of dismantling the samurai class was gradual but relentless. At first, they were stripped of exclusive rights, such as the privilege to wear swords in public. Stipends once guaranteed by feudal lords were converted into government bonds, which often depreciated in value, leaving many former samurai impoverished. The decisive step came with the introduction of universal conscription in 1873. Every male was now required to serve in the army, regardless of class. This measure, though necessary for building a modern military, was a profound shock to samurai identity. The monopoly on bearing arms, which had defined their role for generations, was gone. Resentment flared into uprisings, the most famous being the Satsuma Rebellion in 1877, led by Seigo Takamori, once one of the Restoration's own heroes. Thousands of disaffected samurai rallied to his cause, hoping to restore their lost status. But the government's new conscript army, equipped with modern rifles and artillery, defeated them. The rebellion's failure marked the final death of the samurai as a political force, though their ethos would live on in the ideals of loyalty and sacrifice repurposed for the modern nation. Parallel to these military reforms were sweeping changes in land and economic structures. Under the Tokugawa order, peasants had farmed land owned by daimyo or held under rigid arrangements, and taxes were paid in rice. The new government, seeking a more rational and centralized system, launched the Land Tax Reform of 1873. Land was surveyed and registered under private ownership, and taxes were now assessed in money rather than rice. This shift transformed the relationship between farmers and the state, creating a cash economy that tied villages more closely to the national market. For many peasants, however, the burden remained heavy, and discontent over taxes fueled local unrest. Yet the reform was critical, for it gave the government a stable source of revenue and currency, which was indispensable for funding modernization projects. With these foundational changes underway, Japan turned to the rapid adoption of Western technology and institutions. The leadership understood that time was against them. To renegotiate the humiliating, unequal treaties signed under duress, Japan would have to prove itself the equal of the Western powers. That meant building railways, telegraph lines, modern industries, and schools, as well as creating a bureaucracy capable of administering a centralized nation-state. Within a few decades, the landscape of Japan began to change in visible and dramatic ways. Railways linked Tokyo to Yokohama, Osaka to Kobe, and other key urban centers, reducing travel times that had once taken days to mere hours. Steamships began to carry goods and passengers along the coasts, knitting the islands into a unified market. Factories rose in cities, producing textiles, machinery, and weapons. Telegraph lines carried messages across regions that had once communicated only by courier. The drive to industrialize was not carried out in isolation, but through deliberate learning from abroad. The government invited foreign experts in fields such as engineering, medicine, law, and military science, paying them high salaries to train Japanese counterparts. Students were sent overseas to Europe and America to study and return with knowledge that could be adapted to Japanese needs. One of the most striking examples of this process was the creation of a modern navy modeled on Britain's and an army modeled on Prussia's. Uniforms, drills, and command structures were carefully studied and implemented. At the same time, railways and postal systems were adapted from Western models, and architecture in Tokyo began to reflect European styles. Yet modernization was not confined to infrastructure and the military. The Meiji leaders understood that political institutions would have to evolve as well. The Charter Oath of 1868, issued in the emperor's name, had already promised deliberative assemblies and participation in government. Over the following decades, Japan experimented with forms of political consultation, culminating in the promulgation of a constitution in 1889. This document, modeled partly on the Prussian system, established a constitutional monarchy with a parliament, while still preserving strong powers for the emperor and his government. It represented a careful balance between introducing modern representative institutions and maintaining authority at the center. The new political order gave Japan the appearance of constitutional government, which impressed foreign observers and strengthened its case for equality among nations. Amid all these reforms, the question of identity weighed heavily. To embrace Western technology and institutions risked diluting Japan's cultural essence, yet to reject them outright meant weakness and subjugation. The leaders of the era were acutely aware of this tension. They sought to adopt what was useful while preserving what was uniquely Japanese. This principle was encapsulated in slogans of the time, such as Japanese spirit, Western technique. It meant railways and rifles could be accepted, but the emperor's sacred status would remain untouched. Schools would teach science and mathematics from Western textbooks, but moral education rooted in loyalty, filial piety, and reverence for the nation would ensure that modernization did not erode the foundations of Japanese society. This balancing act was visible in daily life. Western clothing became fashionable in cities, especially for officials and military officers, while traditional attire continued in villages. Western food, architecture, and music appeared in urban settings, but festivals, shrines, and rituals maintained continuity with the past. The calendar itself was shifted to the Gregorian system, aligning Japan with the West, but Shinto ceremonies continued to mark the rhythm of public life. The emperor embodied this synthesis, appearing in Western-style portraits in military dress, yet also performing sacred rituals as a divine descendant of the sun goddess. His image reassured the population that Japan could modernize without losing its soul. Not everyone was convinced. Critics feared that too much foreign influence would corrupt morals and weaken the nation. Intellectual debates flourished, with some arguing for greater democracy and others warning against imitating Western decadence. Peasant uprisings, samurai discontent, and political movements such as the Freedom and People's Rights movement showed that not all were satisfied with the pace or direction of change. Yet despite these tensions, the momentum of reform proved unstoppable. The victories of the government in suppressing rebellions and in steadily building infrastructure and institutions demonstrated that the new order was resilient. By the late 19th century, the results of these transformations were undeniable. Japan had built a modern army and navy, a functioning constitutional system, a growing industrial base, and a centralized education system. Cities bustled with railways, electric lights, and modern buildings, while the countryside was increasingly integrated into a national economy. The sacrifices had been immense. The samurai had vanished as a class, peasants bore heavy tax burdens, and countless individuals had to adapt to new ways of living. Yet the sense of national pride was strong, for Japan had shown that it could transform itself on its own terms, guided by the unifying figure of the emperor and the determination of its leaders. The story of dismantling the old and building the new was thus not simply one of imitation, but of adaptation. Japan looked outward to learn but inward to define itself. It had managed to thread the narrow path between rejection and surrender, crafting a synthesis that preserved identity while embracing innovation. The young emperor, once doubted, had become the face of this transformation. His reign remembered not only for survival, but for the remarkable leap from a feudal, isolated realm to a modern nation-state. The journey was not complete, and challenges would continue, but the foundations had been laid for Japan to stand alongside the world's great powers. The foundations laid in the first decades of the Meiji era prepared Japan for a transformation that few at the time could have predicted. What had begun as a desperate attempt to preserve sovereignty against foreign intrusion grew into an astonishing rise on the global stage. Within a single generation, Japan moved from being a feudal and isolated realm to a nation whose power would be recognized across Asia and beyond. This rise was not merely the product of technology or institutions imported from abroad, but the result of a deliberate vision carried forward in the name of the emperor and embraced by a leadership determined to prove that Japan could stand as an equal among the great powers of the modern world. The military reforms, the conscription system, and the creation of a modern navy were the first tools that allowed Japan to move beyond defense and toward projection of power. The defeat of the Satsuma Rebellion had demonstrated that the new conscript army was capable of overcoming even the most skilled traditional warriors. From there, the government invested heavily in modern weapons, shipyards, and training, often guided by advisors from Europe. The navy modeled on Britain gave Japan the ability to patrol and protect its coasts, while the army modeled on Prussia became a disciplined and effective force. These measures were not simply about defense. They carried within them the ambition to shape Japan's position in Asia. The first test of this ambition came in the conflict with China over Korea in the 1890s. Korea, long a tributary state of China, was of strategic importance, and Japan viewed its control as vital both for security and for influence in the region. When unrest in Korea led to intervention by both China and Japan, war became inevitable. The Sino-Japanese War of 1894 to 1895 shocked the world. Few had expected Japan to prevail against China, a civilization that had long been considered dominant in East Asia. Yet Japan's modern army and navy proved superior in every engagement. Victories on land and sea forced China to sue for peace, and the Treaty of Shimonoseki granted Japan recognition of its interests in Korea and the cession of Taiwan, its first overseas colony. For the Japanese public, this was a moment of immense pride. The humiliations suffered under the unequal treaties were now counterbalanced by proof that Japan could defeat an ancient neighbor and claim a place as a modern power. The triumph was, however, tempered by the intervention of Western powers. Russia, France, and Germany forced Japan to return the Liaodong Peninsula, which it had gained in the treaty, in what became known as the Triple Intervention. Though Japan complied, the incident left deep resentment. It revealed that Western powers still did not consider Japan a full equal, and that victories on the battlefield did not guarantee freedom from foreign manipulation. Yet it also fueled determination. The lesson was clear. Japan would need to grow even stronger if it wished to resist the influence of outsiders and secure its place in the international order. Over the following decade, Japan pursued this goal with relentless focus. Industrialization accelerated, financed by the revenues of land taxes, new industries, and government investment. Shipyards built modern battleships, factories produced arms, and railways expanded further into the countryside. The government also continued to promote education, creating a literate and disciplined population that could serve in the military or the bureaucracy. The emperor's image as both a divine figure and a modern commander-in-chief strengthened the sense of unity and purpose. This preparation came to fruition in the confrontation with Russia at the start of the 20th century. Russia's growing influence in Manchuria and Korea threatened Japan's strategic ambitions. Negotiations failed, and in 1904 Japan launched a surprise attack on the Russian fleet at Port Arthur. The Russo-Japanese War that followed became one of the most significant conflicts of the era. For the first time, an Asian nation fought a European power on equal terms, and the outcome would reverberate around the world. Japanese victories at battles such as Mukden on land and Tsushima at sea demonstrated the effectiveness of the military reforms of the previous decades. When peace was negotiated in 1905 through the Treaty of Portsmouth, mediated by President Theodore Roosevelt of the United States, Japan emerged as the victor. It gained control of Korea as a protectorate, acquired rights in southern Manchuria, and secured recognition as a regional power. The impact of this victory was immense. Across Asia, subject peoples looked to Japan as proof that Western dominance could be challenged. In India, in China, and in other colonized lands, the news that an Asian nation had defeated a European empire was electrifying. For Japan itself, the war confirmed its status as a modern power, worthy of standing among the great nations of the world. The image of the emperor as a victorious commander reinforced national pride, while the sacrifices of soldiers and citizens alike deepened the sense of collective identity. Yet with these triumphs came new responsibilities and new pressures. Japan's acquisition of colonies and protectorates marked the beginning of an imperial role that carried both opportunities and risks. Governing Taiwan and later annexing Korea required vast resources and provoked resistance among the colonized populations. The desire to secure resources and markets drove further expansionist thinking, even as it raised questions about how far Japan should go in emulating the imperialism of Western powers. At home, the costs of war and expansion weighed heavily on the population. Taxes remained high, strikes and protests began to appear in industrial centers, and political movements pushed for greater democracy and accountability. The adoption of a constitution and the establishment of a parliament had introduced new forms of political participation, but the balance of power remained tilted toward the emperor and his advisors. Over time, tensions grew between those who wanted a more open, democratic system and those who believed that unity and strength required centralized authority. The memory of foreign humiliation and the desire to maintain independence fueled support for strong government and military preparedness. At the same time, the growth of urban society, a modern press, and political activism reflected pressures for change. The contradictions between authoritarian traditions and modern democratic aspirations created a strain that would define Japan's path in the decades ahead. Emperor Meiji's reign, which lasted until 1912, thus carried a mixed legacy. On one hand, the achievements were extraordinary. The abolition of feudalism, the creation of a modern state, victory in 2 major wars, and recognition as a world power. On the other hand, the very speed of modernization created imbalances and unresolved tensions. The samurai ethos had been absorbed into a national ideology of loyalty and sacrifice, but now it was directed toward the state and the emperor rather than feudal lords. Industrialization had created prosperity for some but hardship for others, as peasants struggled under tax burdens and urban workers faced poor conditions. Imperial expansion brought prestige, but also drew Japan into the same web of rivalries and conflicts that entangled the West. The vision of Meiji and his leaders was to secure Japan's sovereignty by proving it could master the tools of modernity. In this they succeeded beyond what many had imagined. Yet the very success of that vision set Japan on a trajectory that carried it toward future global conflicts. The belief that survival required strength and expansion became deeply embedded in policy. The army and navy, once instruments of defense, grew into institutions that shaped national politics and influenced foreign decisions. The desire to protect independence turned into a drive to assert dominance. By the time the emperor passed away in 1912, Japan had been utterly remade. It stood no longer as an isolated island nation, but as a regional power with colonies, alliances, and a voice in global affairs. The Meiji era had brought immense progress: railways, universities, a constitution, modern armies, and victories against great powers. It had also brought new societal pressures, from rural hardship to urban unrest, from demands for democracy to the strains of empire. The world would remember Emperor Meiji's reign as one of the most transformative in history, but within that transformation lay seeds of both promise and peril. Japan had stepped onto the global stage with astonishing speed. The question that remained was how it would manage the responsibilities and temptations that came with power. The balance between preserving identity and pursuing modern strength, between unity at home and expansion abroad, and between democratic aspirations and centralized control would continue to define its path. The Meiji vision had lifted Japan from the threat of subjugation to the heights of recognition, but the legacy of rapid modernization would prove to be as complex as it was remarkable. When Emperor Meiji passed away in the summer of 1912, the nation paused in collective grief. His funeral was not merely a ceremony marking the end of a life, but an occasion that symbolized the close of an era that had redefined Japan in every dimension. For those who had witnessed the journey from isolation to modern power, the contrast between the world of the young boy who ascended the throne in 1867 and the world of the mature emperor who left it almost half a century later was staggering. The temples and shrines of Kyoto and Tokyo still stood, the rice paddies still covered the countryside, and Shinto rituals still bound people to the rhythms of tradition. Yet the hum of trains, the clatter of factory machines, the sound of cannons from modern warships, and the debates in a constitutional parliament revealed how far the nation had traveled. The enduring legacy of Emperor Meiji's reign is found not only in the achievements of his own time, but also in the way those achievements continue to shape the Japan of today. The transformation of Japan under Meiji created a new sense of national identity. For centuries, loyalty had been fragmented, tied to local lords or clans, while the emperor existed as a distant symbol in Kyoto. The Restoration changed this by making the emperor the focal point of unity. Through him, reforms were presented not as foreign impositions, but as expressions of Japan's own will. Even when policies were unpopular, such as conscription or land tax reforms, the fact that they were enacted in the emperor's name gave them legitimacy. Over time, the people came to identify themselves less with their village or clan and more with the nation as a whole. This shift in consciousness laid the foundation for a modern state. Today, though Japan is a constitutional monarchy with democratic institutions, the emperor remains a symbol of national unity, a role that traces directly back to the redefinition of imperial authority under Meiji. Politically, the Meiji Restoration established patterns that continue to echo in modern Japan. The Constitution of 1889, though replaced after the Second World War, introduced the idea of representative government, parliamentary debate, and the rule of law. These institutions were imperfect and often tilted toward centralized authority, but they created traditions of political participation and legal order that never fully disappeared. The balance between strong central leadership and representative structures has remained a central theme in Japanese politics ever since. The parliamentary system of today, with its political parties, debates, and coalition governments, is rooted in the soil of Meiji reforms, even if the post-war constitution dramatically altered the emperor's role. Economically, the Meiji era's commitment to modernization set Japan on a trajectory of growth that would continue into the 20th and 21st centuries. The establishment of railways, telegraphs, and industrial plants not only brought Japan into the modern age, but also created the foundation for the economic miracle of the post-war years. The model of state-guided development, where the government played a strong role in fostering industries before handing them to private enterprises, became a hallmark of Japanese economic practice. Today's global corporations, from automobile manufacturers to electronics firms, can trace their lineage back to the early state-sponsored industries and zaibatsu conglomerates of the Meiji period. The idea that Japan could take foreign technology, adapt it, and improve upon it remains a defining feature of the country's economy and innovation culture. Culturally, the Meiji years created a dialogue between tradition and modernity that continues to this day. In the late 19th century, Western dress, architecture, and education were embraced, but always alongside an insistence that Japanese spirit must be preserved. That balancing act is visible even now. Modern skyscrapers rise beside ancient temples, anime and cutting-edge robotics coexist with centuries-old festivals, and Western democratic ideals function within a society still deeply influenced by Confucian and Shinto values. This ability to blend without losing identity is one of the most distinctive elements of Japanese culture, and it was first forged in the crucible of Meiji transformation. The foreign policy vision of Meiji also left an enduring mark. The idea that Japan must never again be vulnerable to foreign domination drove both the drive to modernize and the determination to build military strength. Victories over China and Russia proved that Japan could stand as a global power, but they also planted seeds of future expansionism. The belief that national survival depended on strength, independence, and influence abroad would shape Japan's path through the 20th century, leading eventually to conflicts that brought both triumph and tragedy. While the legacy of wartime aggression casts a long shadow, the underlying determination to secure sovereignty and respect on the world stage remains part of Japan's identity, even as the nation now pursues peace and diplomacy. Perhaps the most profound legacy of Emperor Meiji's reign is the lesson it offers about the capacity of societies to transform themselves. Japan in the mid-19th century faced a situation that seemed almost impossible. A feudal system, outdated weapons, rigid social hierarchies, and the looming threat of Western imperialism. Yet within the span of a few decades, it redefined itself, not by surrendering its culture, but by channeling its traditions into the project of modern state-building. It is difficult to find another example in history where such profound change was achieved in such a short time. The Meiji era demonstrates that identity and innovation need not be opposites, that a society can absorb foreign ideas while still maintaining its essence, and that unity of vision can allow a nation to leap across centuries of development. At the same time, the legacy is not without its complexities. Rapid change created dislocation, hardship, and inequality. Peasants bore heavy tax burdens, workers in new factories endured long hours and low pay, and the dissolution of the samurai class left many adrift. The embrace of militarism and imperial ambition, while bringing short-term victories, contributed to later conflicts that would devastate Asia and Japan itself. The Meiji legacy is therefore not a simple story of progress, but a reminder of the costs of transformation. Progress and peril were intertwined, and the choices made in those years shaped both the achievements and the tragedies of the century that followed. Today, when Japan is known for technological sophistication, cultural creativity, and political stability, it is easy to forget how precarious its position once was. The skyscrapers of Tokyo, the speed of the Shinkansen, the influence of Japanese design and pop culture around the world, all of these rest on foundations laid in the Meiji era. The emphasis on education, the adaptation of foreign ideas, the balance between tradition and modernity, and the unifying symbolism of the emperor are threads that still run through Japanese life. When Japanese citizens bow before the emperor during ceremonies, when trains run with precise punctuality, when innovation emerges alongside reverence for heritage, the echoes of Meiji are present. For the wider world, the story of Meiji Japan offers a powerful example. It shows that no society is locked into decline if it has the will to change, that even in the face of overwhelming pressure from stronger powers, a determined nation can reinvent itself. It also warns that rapid modernization must be guided carefully, for the energies it unleashes can lead to both renewal and conflict. As we look back on the life and reign of Emperor Meiji, we are left with a question that resonates beyond Japan itself. What can we learn from this unprecedented transformation achieved in so short a time? It is a question about resilience, about the balance between tradition and innovation, and about the ways in which societies respond to crisis. For Japan, the answer was found in the creation of a modern state that preserved its cultural essence while embracing the tools of a new age. For others, the lesson may be that transformation is possible, but it must be pursued with both vision and caution. The Meiji era remains not just a chapter in Japan's history, but a mirror in which all nations can see possibilities for renewal and the risks that accompany it.